Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming tonight. I'm really excited to see so many people here. And this is a really exciting evening for us. As most of you know, I assume you're all here for the same reason I am. We have a wonderful guest here tonight. Peter Hart is going to share his experiences about making Shakey, the robot. So the design and development of that technology and some probably pretty interesting stories from along the path. So please help me welcome Peter Hart.
Is this working? Yes. Well, thank you so much, Kay. Thank you so much for inviting me here. It's really a kick to be giving a talk about Shakey here in the museum where Shakey's been living for the last several years. So it's a wonderful opportunity. To start, I've given many talks in Japan. And in Japan, talks always begin with an apology, whereas in the US, it always begins with a joke. So I'm always torn which to do, but in this case, I have to kind of apologize because this previous slide was supposed to be a video that shows Shakey shaking around. I had to learn the word eponymous, which I think means it sounds like its name, because if you ever go to YouTube and just say Shakey on YouTube, you'll see that it kind of a little spastic. So anyway, I have to apologize because we couldn't make this movie work. But everything else works. I'd like to tell you a story tonight. And this is a story about how a group of researchers were inspired by a brilliant physicist named Charlie Rosen to do something that had never been done before. We wanted to build the world's first mobile intelligent robot. So I'll tell you how this project got launched, how we approached this entirely new world of robots, a number of the things we actually did, and a bit of what the world was like back then when viewed from the perspective of somebody making robots. And I'll also talk some about what the impact has been from this project on technology today and really on the everyday lives of all of us. So that's the plan. Well, here's the proposal that launched it all, submitted by the Artificial Intelligence Center of Stanford Research Institute, now called SRI International, to the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the Department of Defense. And it was submitted 50 years ago this past January, which by coincidence happened to be the same year that the Stanford Computer Science Department was founded. So you can see this was extremely early days in the history of computer science. Now, I should say a little bit about this proposal. If you look at the highlights, we propose to develop intelligent automata for reconnaissance applications. But the research motivation, and this was Charlie Rosen's inspiration, was to build an experimental test bed for integrating all the subfields of artificial intelligence. So we wanted to integrate the subfield of knowledge representation and reasoning, machine learning, automatic planning, computer vision, even natural language understanding and speech. So that was really what the thought process was underlying all this, was an experimental test bed that for the first time ever would integrate all those areas of artificial intelligence. So here's Charlie. Again, this rendering isn't too good, but there's Charlie with the automaton, as he used to call it. And I think he used to call it an automaton out of some justifiable concern that if you called it a robot, nobody would take you seriously, because you have to remember that until then, robots were literally works of fiction. But before too long, Charlie and all the rest of us called it a robot. Here's Shakey in a little more detail. Starting at the bottom here, we put the drive wheels on the side so that we could steer by pivoting. And we use stepping motors to drive the wheels so we could count clicks and use that for dead reckoning purposes. We had a low-resolution TV camera, Vidicon-based TV camera, for which, by the way, we had to build our own analog to digital converters because there were no such thing as frame grabbers back then. Up here is a radio link, an antenna with its own little ground plane for communicating with the mainframe that I'll show you shortly. And there's a story behind that one. Initially, Shakey was connected to the mainframe by a very cumbersome overhead cable. And it took us a couple of years to get approval from the FCC to use an experimental radio. So we had this giant cumbersome cable. So years later, Shakey is doing whatever experiment we were doing. It stops in the middle of whatever it's doing. It does a pirouette 360 degrees. Then it continues up with its business like nothing happened. So what's that all about? So somebody drilled down on the code and found some vestigial code to untwist the cable every now and then. Above and below the TV camera is a triangulating rangefinder. In this housing up here, there's a rotating mirror that sweeps the vertical laser beam, and below the TV camera is a receiving lens. This is onboard controls and logic. Later, we added some bump detectors and a push bar. There was a design philosophy underlying this. We had two design principles. The first was that we wanted to minimize mechanical complexity, and so we never mounted any arms on Shakey, although the first concept designs showed two arms. And the second was that we didn't want to spend time and money micro-miniaturizing the components or anthropomorphizing the components, and that accounts for Shakey's blocky shape. It's basically an electronics rack on wheels with a sensor assembly on top. The whole thing was powered by a couple of Sears truck batteries. Oops. We had to build an experimental environment for Shakey, and we were keenly aware of the limited mechanical, perceptual, and computational capacity, so we built an experimental environment that was correspondingly simple. About a half a dozen rooms with doorways, but no physical doors between them, and a bunch of those great big boxes that you saw. We're sometimes asked about the colors of these blocks, which maybe you could see in a better rendition, were painted kind of red and white. And the reason was that we wanted to pick colors where we had a chance of picking up the edges with our limited video while still reflecting enough laser light for the laser rangefinder to work. So that's why they're red and white. And then you could barely see in this rendering some dark baseboards. And I actually caused those baseboards to be installed so that, again, we could see them with our limited video capacity, and we used them as landmarks to update the position error that accumulates when you dead reckon. Here was our first computer. It was an early time-shared mainframe, the SDS 940. And when I was doing a little research for this talk, I happened to notice that the main memory on this mainframe, which of course filled a room about this big and served 30 people, was about half the size of the L2 cache on my 3-year-old MacBook. If you don't know what an L2 cache is, let's just say it's a real small part of the memory on this machine. A few years later, we upgraded to a much more powerful DEC PDP-10. Part of that PDP-10 system was a gigantic drum, bigger than a rotating drum, bigger than a refrigerator, that was used for swapping timeshare jobs in and out. That giant drum had a capacity of a little over a megabyte, and in current dollars cost $1.5 million, so a bit over $1 a byte. Try to get your head around that the next time you wander down to Fry's and pick up memory of any kind for not much more than pocket change. About the time that we got the 10, we embarked on a major rewrite of most of Shakey software. And I'll be talking for the rest of this time about this version 2 of Shakey software. We'd made very little change to the hardware from that point on. This Shakey was connected to the 10 via a communication controller, and this whole system was in the initial set of nodes at the birth of the ARPANET. This was the BBM router, the interface message processor. So we were the first half a dozen or whatever total nodes there were on the ARPANET, and I remember address list of email addresses came around on 4 sheets of paper, and that was all the email addresses in the known galaxy. So let me go on to talk about this version 2 of Shakey, and this will be mostly about software, and I should issue a kind of a nerd alert that there are occasional moments in the story that get a little bit technical, and I think you'll pretty much be able to get the idea, but if you don't worry about it. Those moments will pass quickly, and you won't really have lost very much. So there were 2 big ideas between this version 2 of Shakey software. The first idea was that we were going to represent Shakey's world using a particular kind of mathematical logic called first-order predicate calculus. Now, obviously, every self-respecting intelligent robot needs some kind of model of the world in order to reason about it. And so we decided to use this language of predicate calculus that replaced an earlier model that was basically a kind of a grid, a map-like model that we had in version 1. But in spite of its intimidating name, you can see this is really pretty easy to understand. This is just a little fragment of the model, of course. So you look at this first one that says the robot is at these coordinates, 6.2 and 10. And the door status of door D1 is open, meaning that it's not blocked by an object. And going on down, the door D1 connects those 2 rooms. So in spite of its name, it's pretty easy to see what's going on in this model. So that was one big idea, and I'll tell you later why we adopted that. The second big idea was we decided to structure Shakey's control software in a series of 4 layers, going from the bottom, low-level actions, up to the top. Now, this was not, well, I should say for non-technical people, layered software designs is not a newsflash in 2015. But it was quite unusual then. I don't think it was unique, but it was unusual then. It was certainly the first time layered software had been used for a robot because there weren't any others. So that was easy to get a first on that one. Kind of a cheap shot first. So let me tell you about each of these levels, beginning with the low-level actions at the bottom and working my way up. The low-level actions communicated directly with Shakey's hardware. There were things like turn or pan the camera head or roll. So there's not much to say about them. They're machine language routines. They loaded registers on Shakey, and that caused motors to turn. So there's not much more to say. Just above them were the intermediate level actions, and they're much more interesting. So here is one called Bumble Through, and Bumble Through tries to get Shakey through a doorway by making a little course correction if it happens to hit the side of the door. And just above Bumble Through was its big brother, GOTHRUDR. Now, the reason we put these intermediate level actions in their own separate layer is because all of them were written in a very kind of rigid, stylized form of software called a Markov table. And so let me show you what a Markov table looks like. This is a Markov table for going through a door. It's really pretty easy to see what's going on once you get the basics. These are conditions, these are actions. And the way the program works is that you look down this list of conditions sequentially until you find the first one that's true. And after you find that one, you execute the corresponding action. And then you go back to the top and start over again. So, for example, to go through a door, if Shakey is in front of the door and it knows the door is open, the state of the door is equal to the word open, so it's not blocked by an object, well, then call that action Bumble Through. If not, do some other things. If you're near the door, for example, and you don't know whether the door is unblocked, take a picture and analyze it. Try to figure that out. On the other hand, if you know the door is blocked, it's closed, you've returned a failure. Sorry, boss, I can't do that. It's above my pay grade. Find somebody else to fix that problem. So because of a key point, because of this looping behavior, going back to the top, these Markov tables have a certain inherent perseverance. They keep trying and trying until they either succeed or they fail. And that's going to turn out to be important. Now, if these intermediate level actions were the end of the story, Shakey would be extremely limited in what it could do. would only be able to accomplish goals that require it to execute just a single one of these intermediate level actions, and we're the ones who programmed all of these things. So how can you be a self-respecting, intelligent robot if the only thing you can do is execute some program that some guy wrote? If we want Shakey to be able to do much more than that, those pre-programmed actions, there has to be some way to compose a sequence of actions to accomplish some larger goal. In other words, Shakey has to be able to make a plan. That's the job of the next layer of software, the STRIPS Stanford Research Institute problem solver. Its job is to construct plans. So STRIPS came about by combining two hot topics of the era. The first was a method called means-ends analysis, which was exemplified by the work of Al Newell and Herb Simon, two of the founders of artificial intelligence. They built a program called the General Problem Solver, a program that simulates human thought. And it relied on this little technique called means-ends analysis. Means-ends analysis, very simple, intuitive idea. Goes something like this. Say, if you're in a current situation and you're trying to achieve some final situation, there are probably a bunch of differences between those. Pick one of them, and of all the actions that are available to you, consider executing an action that reduces that difference or eliminates that difference. So this takes quite a lot of searching around, but if you can find a sequence of actions that eliminate all the differences, you're there. You've solved the problem. So that's the idea behind means-ends analysis. The second big idea was an invention. This was a very hot breakthrough, an invention by a mathematician named J.A. Robinson. He invented a method by which you could program a computer to prove mathematical theorems. The only hitch was that it had to be in this first-order predicate calculus language that I described earlier. And that's the reason that we moved to that kind of language to describe Shakey's world. Two of our researchers, Rich Fikes and Nils Nilsson, combined that theorem proving by resolution with this means-ends analysis to create STRIPS, which applied means-ends analysis to predicate calculus representations of the sort that Shakey's model was now composed of. So that's the third layer up. A little later, we figured out how to extend STRIPS and created something called PlanX, the Plan Execution Executive. And what we did was we figured out how to take a STRIPS plan and generalize it in a way I'll tell you in a moment. And we also invented these triangle tables, which look kind of like a AAA mileage chart to represent the internal structure of a plan. And so this formed the basis of our top-level PlanX. There's a lot going on here that gets very much to the heart of what does it take to control an intelligent robot. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time here and tell you first the why and the what of PlanX, and then get on to telling you something about how it's done. So let's start with the why. I mentioned that Shakey was the world's first mobile intelligent robot, but was also the first ever integrated artificial intelligence and physical system. And we recognized quite early on that there was a huge difference between planning for Shakey, who had to execute the plan in the real world where many things can go wrong, and the planning programs like the General Problem Solver up to that point that only had to come up with a paper solution. So let me give you an example. Suppose we ask that General Problem Solver that I mentioned to solve the famous monkey and banana problem. You remember that's the problem where there's a monkey, it's like to get some bananas hanging way overhead from the ceiling, way too high to jump up and get. But there is a chair around, and so the solution is for the monkey to push the chair over to under the banana, climb on the chair, get the banana. If the General Problem Solver solves that problem, all it does is print it out, that series of steps. It never has to worry about what happens if, say, the monkey knocks the chair over while it's pushing it. But in the case of Shakey, we very definitely did have to worry about that sort of thing. And so that's why we needed this top-level plan execution executive. So that's the why. Now the what. Using this software machinery, which I have not yet described, but I will, PlanX could monitor Shakey's real-world execution of a plan. It could detect if something had gone wrong, and if it had, it could replan from that point, reusing any portion of the existing plan if that was still applicable. In fact, it could even do better than that. It could be opportunistic in the sense that if by some good fortune it was closer to achieving a goal, it could exploit that as well. So that's the what of Plan X. Now let me get to the how, which is the most interesting part. I mentioned there were two parts to this, generalizing plans in these triangle tables, so I'll tell you about each one. So first, what do I mean by plan generalization? Well, by way of example, let's suppose that we give Shakey a pretty easy task, which is to block a particular doorway, say doorway D1. And there's several blocks around, and so Shakey comes up with a plan, go to a particular block, like say block B1, and push that over to doorway D1. That'll solve the problem. So in that plan, B1 and D1 are constants because they refer to those specific objects and entities. Now, we're going to want to save this plan in some form so we can use it to monitor execution. And we could save it in exactly the form that I just stated it. But it's much more useful if we recognize that this little two-step plan can be used to block any door using any block, any door D with any block B. So we can generalize it in that sense. Now, why is that helpful? Well, a couple of reasons. First of all, suppose as Shakey starts to execute this plan, some scoundrel comes along, grabs the block, runs off with it, and it's out of the picture. Shakey gets to where the block is supposed to be to push. No block. Now what do I do? Well, if we have this generalized plan, we see that actually any block will do. And maybe there's another block, B2 nearby. Same plan works. Just substitute B2, go over to B2, push it to doorway D1, I'm done. So that's a big advantage, but it's not the biggest advantage. The biggest advantage is that once we learn this general plan, we can use it to help solve future planning problems. You can think of it as just another action. It's a little fancier than those pre-programmed intermediate level actions that we start with, but it's just another action. We can just throw it into the pot, and Shakey can use it for future planning problems. So in this way, as Shakey learns plans, we call them, by the way, macro operators or macrops. As Shakey learns these plans, it can use it for future. It basically keeps getting smarter and smarter. It gets more and more planning ability. So that's the story on the generalization. Now, what about these triangle tables? Well, to get into that topic, let's think for a second about why a step is in a plan. Every step in a plan is there for one of two possible reasons. And by the way, it's as true of your plans as Shakey's. One reason is that it could be the step that actually accomplishes the goal. So of course, that's always the last step. But it might be an earlier step if there's a compound goal with multiple parts to be satisfied. So that's one reason. The other reason is that a step is there in order to set up a precondition for some subsequent step. So you need to establish that precondition. By the way, as an aside, I mentioned the monkey and the banana problem. We actually built a version of the monkey and banana problem for Shakey to solve. Now, obviously, Shakey can't climb on a chair or reach for a banana, so we had to do something different. And what we did was we built a small, very low platform, put a block on it, and asked Shakey to push the block off the platform. Well, Shakey can't actually climb on a platform any more than he can climb on a chair. But we also provided a ramp that could be pushed around. And so Shakey found the solution: go to the ramp, push the ramp to the platform, go up the ramp to the top of the platform, go to the box, now you can push the box off. So if you look at one of the steps, why push the ramp to the platform? Well, because that's what you need to get Shakey on the platform, and that's needed for subsequent steps. So that's the kind of basic idea that all plans have this kind of, if there's a linear plan with no branches, all plans have this kind of structure. It could be yours and mine, as I said, as well as Shakey's. And so what the triangle table does is capture that. I won't step through the details, but what the triangle table represents, it says for each step of the plan, it shows exactly those conditions that are required if Shakey's going to successfully execute the remaining steps of the plan. So why is that so important? Well, again, because the world's a dynamic place. Lots of things could be changing as Shakey steps through a plan. The question does any of that matter? Will any of those changes prevent Shakey from completing the plan? And the answer is only if something changes in those required conditions. If not, you could ignore them, just go about your business. If so, time to replan. So that's the idea behind this. It really gets to the essence of how you have to control a robot. Well, I have to say, we thought this was pretty cool stuff. So one afternoon, I wandered over to Stanford, and I gave a talk on this to John McCarthy's graduate seminar on knowledge representation and planning. We thought it was pretty hot. So John was in the back of this little seminar room, and as soon as I finished, he stood up, and if any of you ever knew or remember John, he was one of the founders of the field. He had this like mischievous little twinkle in his eye, and he looks at me and he says, "Oh, Peter, you mean a trivial plan generalization?" Well, that took a little of the wind out of my sails. I mean, I wasn't that much out of graduate school myself. And here's John McCarthy, the founder of the field and the guy who actually named it, telling me the whole thing is trivial. So that took a little bit of the glow off of it. But as it turned out, not everybody agreed with John that this stuff was trivial. And as the years passed, this paper we wrote on learning and executing generalized robot plans was said to be the most republished paper in the history of artificial intelligence, at least up to some point. So I guess it worked out okay. Okay, well, I've told you a lot about the core software stack on Shakey, the things that you need to operate a robot, but you actually need quite a few other things. So I'll tell you about two other aspects, computer vision and navigation. So let me go on to how do you do computer vision. Our original plan was we wouldn't. The original plan was we were just going to, remember we have an experimental test bed for integrating stuff. There was a minor bug in the project plan. There wasn't much to integrate. In fact, I go so far as to say that the entire state-of-the-art of computer vision in those days can be summed up by two documents. The first was Larry Roberts' seminal dissertation in which he introduced concepts of edge detection in digital images and model matching. And the other was Azrael Rosenfeld's first ever textbook on computer vision. So there was nothing to use, so we had to get to work. One of the things that came out of that was the modern version of something called the Hough transform. There's kind of an interesting story behind that I'd like to tell you. In 1962, a very bright guy named Paul Hough, working for the Atomic Energy Commission and analyzing bubble chamber photographs, came up with a very clever way for detecting when dots in an image are collinear. When do they line up? And his idea was, for every dot in an image that you're trying to see, you use a little equation and convert that dot to a straight line in what's called the transform space. And you can easily prove that if they're intersecting lines in the transform space, the points that they came from in the image line up in a straight line. It was a very clever idea. But Azrael Rosenfeld, whose book I just mentioned, pointed out a very serious bug. And the bug was that if you start to get lines in this transform space that are vertical, that means the slope is infinite, and that means the transform space is infinite in extent. That's very inconvenient computationally. We don't like to deal with infinite anythings in our computers. So nobody used this stuff. Around that time, I was looking into an obscure branch of 19th century mathematics called integral geometry, trying to get some ideas. Integral geometry is very poorly named. It's actually about calculating the probability of random geometric events. But I learned one very interesting thing. I learned that when the mathematicians wanted an equation for a straight line, they didn't use the equation that we all learned in high school. The only equation I knew was y equals mx plus b, you know, slope and intercept. That's what Hough used. Maybe he didn't get any further than I did in high school. But mathematicians didn't use that. They had very good reasons for using a form of equation for a straight line that involves sines and cosines. I had never seen it before. But sure enough, it computes straight lines. Aha. I saw that if we swap out Hough's linear transform, the one that we all would have used, for this new one I just learned about, you get this sinusoidal transform. And it has a terrific property that the transform space is not infinite. In fact, the whole transform space is one little tiny rectangle. Bingo. So that's what's been used ever since. My friend and colleague Dick Duda and I also figured out how to extend this method so you can detect other curves in images, for example, the arc of a circle. And that comes in very handy too, and I'll show you some of that later. This is really a cute story, and a while ago somebody asked me to write it up for the history column of the IEEE Signal Processing magazine, and I wouldn't normally put this in a talk except we're in the Computer History Museum. So let me get on to navigation and the A-star algorithm. So Shakey, of course, had to find its way around, and so we actually invented several different procedures or algorithms for finding the shortest path through some space. And one of them was called the A-star algorithm. And we thought that was super cool for two, I think, very good reasons. We could mathematically prove that this computer algorithm had two wonderful properties. The first property is it always works. I can prove that this algorithm will always find the shortest route. That's nice to know. The second is that it's computationally efficient. It considers the fewest number of intersections and turns of any algorithm that works. Well, it's pretty hot stuff, so of course we were eager to break into print with this. But we were in for a rude disappointment. It kept getting rejected, our little manuscript. Here's a rejection letter from the most prestigious journal of the day, the Journal of the Association for Computer Machinery, Ed McCluskey, then at Stanford. We said, Ed, what's wrong with these guys? This is great. Sorry, we can't accept it. What is going on? Well, I'll tell you my hypothesis. You know, you get these anonymous referees' comments, and reading between the lines, I think this is what happened. So Ed gets our manuscript and sees that it's full of these theorems. They weren't theorems in computer science in those days, or at least very few papers had them. Theorems, give them to a mathematician to review. Mathematician takes a look at it and says, hey, you know, this whole thing is restricted to worlds that only have a finite number of roads and a finite number of intersections. Who could possibly be interested in such a boring, finite world? Turn it down. To my mind, this is an early illustration of the difference between mathematicians and computer scientists. Mathematicians sees very little difference between a map that has 10 intersections and 10 quadrillion intersections. It's just some finite number. For computer scientists, you know what? That makes a difference. Well, we were so annoyed at this that one of my co-authors, Bert Rayfield, went out and co-founded a new journal of artificial intelligence, so it didn't happen again. We eventually got it accepted in what I always considered the lowest prestige journal of the day, that I used to somewhat impolitely call the IEEE Transactions on Miscellany, because you just never had any idea what you see in an issue. But it eventually got noticed, and it still gets cited, from Google Scholar, still gets cited almost 50 years after it was published. Well, I think this is enough chat about the technical aspects, what we actually did. Let me go on to what the world was like back then from the point of view of a roboticist. That name didn't exist then. And what was the intellectual and cultural climate of the times? Well, here's a magazine that some of you may remember, very popular today. And in 1970, it was running a cover story on co-ed dorms. And inside, there was a big spread on Shakey by a journalist by the name of Brad Darrach. I don't know, can you read this in the back of the room? Well, I think Brad hyperventilated just a bit. Here it says, meet Shakey, the first electronic person. The fascinating and fearsome reality of a machine with a mind of its own is like, you know, ooh. So he was a little bit, you know, hyperbolic. But while there were some like Brad who worried about this sort of thing, there were lots of skeptics. One prominent skeptic was Bert Dreyfus at UC Berkeley, who wrote this book a little bit later. And Bert is a professional philosopher who argued on deep philosophical grounds that artificial intelligence is in principle impossible. Not just you haven't gotten it, in principle you can't get there. One afternoon, I went up to Berkeley and debated Bert in front of a standing room only audience in a huge Berkeley lecture hall. And all I can tell you is at the end of 2 hours, neither of us made a dent in the other's opinion. Somewhere in between the two, Brad Darrick and Bert Dreyfus, there were labor union leaders who worried that robots might someday take manufacturing jobs, and they were probably the most right on. This is a graph from last week's Wall Street Journal showing the installation of manufacturing robots worldwide, and you can see it's exponential. Now you can get another view of what the world was like back then by looking at the world through the eyes of our visitors. And we had boatloads because we had pretty much an open door policy. You wanted to come? Sure, drop in. So for example, one afternoon a school group visited us, and after seeing Shakey, a teacher asked, "What's your real job around here? What do you really do?" I said, "Excuse me?" He says, "Well, this robot's your hobby, isn't it?" And then we had lots of military people visit. We all remember the general who saw Shakey, and he only had one question for us. He said, "Can you mount a 36-inch blade on that?" Either we said, "Hell, we can mount a 42-inch blade on that." But of course, none of us knew whether he meant a bulldozer blade or a bayonet blade, and we didn't care. And then there was this high school kid who had somehow heard about Shakey and drove down from Seattle with his buddy Paul to see it. And decades later, he still remembers, we have direct information, he still remembers being very impressed with this, and he particularly liked Shakey solving the monkey and banana problem. Is there anybody here who doesn't recognize this as a teenage Bill Gates? One of our big deal visitors was the day that Arthur C. Clarke came to visit us just after the movie 2001 had come out. And we were really eager to talk to him about the future of robots, but it seemed the only thing he wanted to talk about was a New York Times review of the movie, so we never actually got too far. One of my more memorable visitors was the US government auditor who stopped by my office one day. We were all on government contracts, and of course I had to be on my best behavior. He pulled out this file from a fat briefcase, and he starts asking me a bunch of questions. He says, "Is it true that you've received 8 billion and something or other packets of bits?" Well, I hadn't seen that one coming. But I said, "Well, it sounds about right. I can check it." "No, it's okay." I said, "Check." And he says, "Did you have inspection procedures set up to inspect the condition of these incoming packets?" Now I could see where this was going. So I thought to myself, you know, there's got to be an error detecting code somewhere in the communication path. Close enough. So I said, yeah. I said yes. And then he said, "Well, did these packets arrive in good condition? Was there any tarnish or corrosion on any of the bits?" I could be absolutely truthful. "No, sir, no tarnish or corrosion." And then he asked me if I had adequate warehousing facilities. Didn't you see all those disk drives in the machine room across the floor? So he thanked me and left. So that's what the world looked like, seen through the eyes of visitors. I know you can't make this stuff up. Let me talk now about Shakey's legacy. That was the world back then. Here we are today. What's happened in between? Has Shakey had any lasting impact on current technology or in everyday lives? And the answer is yes, a surprising amount, and I'll show you a bunch of examples, and I'm indebted to my friend Nils Nilsson, who dug all this stuff up, and I'm using his material. There are half a dozen different areas where we can directly trace Shakey's influence, and I'll go through these one by one, spending a little more time on some than the other. So the first one is these control architectures, and you remember that picture, this 4-layer controller. It turns out that that's used in lots of modern robots. Here are two. Here is the self-driving vehicle that won the DARPA Grand Challenge in the Mojave Desert about 10 years ago, Sebastian Thrun's project. And I was chatting with Sebastian about this and asked him about this stuff. And he said, Peter, he said, he directed me to a particular figure in one of his technical papers. He says, take a look at that. It'll look familiar. So I look at it as a very complicated system diagram. Right in the middle, something like that layer diagram. And here's a modern robot you can barely see. It's actually an underwater robot from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, MBARI. And I spoke to the project leader there. They still use that stuff today. Now, if you ask why did this architecture survive for half a century, we're talking about software, right? What software ideas survive half a century? I don't think it's because this layered design is so uniquely insightful that it took a team of geniuses to dream it up. I think the reason it's used is because we were the first. And so this is a solid, reasonable engineering solution to a problem that every robot designer has had ever since, and so it's used as kind of a template. Let me go on to this robust plan execution, and I'll just talk quite a lot about the effort we put into that. I was trying to give you some idea when I was telling you about that of how much it took to give the most rudimentary intelligence to a robot to be able to plan and execute. And so that kind of design has been used many places since. Savioke 1 is the most interesting one. Sorry for the poor rendering. Savioke is a startup company that wants to build service robots for hotels, room service robots for hotels to run around and, you know, get your eggs in the morning. And that uses the same kind of design. There's actually a whole literature on that, but I won't spend time on that. The next one is adaptive cell decomposition. I mentioned earlier in passing that this version 2 of Shakey that used this predicate calculus model largely supplanted a kind of grid-like model that we used in version 1, a kind of a two-dimensional map. If you're the guy designing that map, you have a kind of a trade-off to make. How big do you want those cells to be? On the one hand, you'd like to make them really small so you have good resolution. The same reason you want lots of pixels in your camera and on your TV. But that's computationally very expensive, and I showed you how tiny the memories were. So on the other hand, you want them big so you don't use up a lot of computer memory. So what we did, instead of making a fixed compromise, we invented something that later became called adaptive cell decomposition. And the idea is you put lots of resolution, tiny cells where there's something going on, and great big empty cells where nothing's going on. That's kind of the best of all possible worlds, where you divide the grid up in that fashion. That was the first use of adaptive cell decomposition, and that's used everywhere today. It's used actually in robots today, and it's also used in three-dimensional versions in computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacturing, and for exactly the same reason. Put the high resolution where you need it. Don't spend effort where you don't. Let me go on to planning and strips rules, and this I'm going to spend a little time on because it's pretty interesting. Let's go back to the basics of what would you do if you had to build a robot planner? Well, the first thing you have to do is you have to say, well, what actions are available to me for the planner to use? And then for each of those actions, you want to know, well, what does it do? And what are the conditions under which it can be used? And the way we handled that was we created these things called strips rules that have 3 parts. The preconditions, which have to be used, have to be satisfied in order to use an action. The delete list, which are things that will no longer be true after the action's taken, and an add list, which are things that become true. And that's become the bread and butter for almost every planner ever since. The rest of strips not, but this way of characterizing actions has. And so here's a genealogy chart that shows a whole bunch of planners over the years that are sort of descendants of strips and use that. These planners are used in actual real life. For example, I don't know if you can see it in the back, but this is actually the logo of Australian Brewery, and they plan their production schedules for making beer using this stuff. So I hope everybody here appreciates this is really important stuff. It's also, these kinds of strips rules are also used in loads and loads of video games. to plan the actions of what are called NPCs, the non-player characters. So it's really comforting that we made the world safe for video games. There's more on that later. So let me go on to A-star and heuristic search. Remember, that's our shortest path algorithm. A-star has spawned a whole literature. There are loads and loads of variants and descendants of A-star. There's bidirectional A-star, where you plan from the goal and the star together. There's hierarchical A-star, where you plan the local streets at a detailed level and cross-country journeys at a freeway level. There's memory-based A-star, where you save routes for future use. There are other versions of A-star for use in open country, where you want to kind of round off the curves and not make sharp corners. There are versions of A-star that are used when you have partially unknown areas or dynamically changing areas. There's a big literature on this stuff, and it's used everywhere. Right now, as we sit, there's a version of A-star called Field D-star that's driving the Curiosity rover around on Mars. And you have to remember that nobody can drive a vehicle when there's a 40-minute propagation delay between when you turn the steering wheel and when you see what happens to the vehicle. So it has to have local steering autonomy, and it uses this variant called Field D-star. If you remember that initial proposal that said we were going to work on reconnaissance applications, it's a hell of a reconnaissance application. Yeah. Of course, it took 50 years, but. For computing your driving directions back here on Earth, the companies that provide those services aren't as forthcoming as the friendly folks at JPL that own the Curiosity rover. Folks like Google aren't as forthcoming as to exactly how they do it. But from what I know, I can tell you that when your driving directions are computed, whether it's in your car's GPS or on a mapping website or on your phone or on my bike Garmin, it's a near certainty that some version of A-star is inside doing the heavy lifting. A-star is also used in certain computer applications like parsing, when you have to parse sentences in computers. And in another wonderful consequence, A-star is by far the most widely used application in video games to plan the paths of characters. So A-star is pretty much everywhere. Let's get last to computer vision, and I mentioned the Hough transform. We made a lot of use of the Hough transform at the time. Remember, I mentioned those baseboards that we use for landmarks. We identified them with the Hough transform, and the edges of those blocks we could pick up using the Hough transform. In fact, it worked so well that we didn't use the laser rangefinder as much as we thought, because the video system worked better than we thought it would. But in the non-experimental world, our version of the Hough transform has been used for decades in manufacturing applications where it's used for visual inspection applications. But in the last few years, it started appearing in automobiles. In the last 2 or 3 years, quite a few manufacturers have introduced what they call driver assist functions. And one of the popular ones is called lane keeping assist. And here's a picture I took just in the dashboard of my car, sitting in the driver's seat, showing that something called active lane keeping assist is turned on. And what that does is, if I drift out of lane without signaling, the car alerts me, and if I still don't do anything, it actually nudges the car back into lane. Well, again, manufacturers don't normally tell you how this stuff works, but in this case, I know the backstory. So in the early 1990s, I visited Daimler-Benz's enormous research campus in Ulm, Germany. I always like to tell this story because I always like to have an excuse to say Ulm. But they have a giant research campus, and I went and saw the folks at the computer vision research group, and they were very excited to show me an early demo of this. And what they had was a video taken out of the front window of a car, and it showed these lane markings going down the road, and there are these intermittent lane markings on the road. And the video was picking up those lane markings And in real time, our version of the Hough transform is fitting curves and straight lines to those lane segments. And so fast forward 20 years or so, and that's what's in my car now. So it's like a lot of other things in artificial intelligence. It's always taken a few decades to become an overnight success. So let me sum up a bit. Here are some of the people who made Shakey. Not everybody's there, but there's Charlie, and I'm hiding in the back there with the big mustache I used to have. And down in the front is Helen Chan Wolf, who I came to think of as the Lady Ada Lovelace of Shakey. I think Helen has a really good claim to being called the world's first robot programmer. Many of the other people's names in this picture wouldn't be known. They wouldn't be familiar to current researchers in robotics. And I find that's often the way it is in research. Behind the people who get the recognition, there's a team of unsung heroes and heroines. They're the ones that did the heavy lifting. Here we are, here are some of us today, and you can see none of us have changed, especially Helen, who really hasn't changed. And of course, I hope everybody in this room knows that this is where Shakey is today, just practically around the corner. Shakey was also a charter member of the Robot Hall of Fame in Carnegie Mellon University. It's one of the first 3 inductees there. Well, so what did we achieve? Speaking for myself, I have to say much less than I had hoped for. And of course, 50 years later, we still haven't achieved everything I had hoped for, so it's no surprise given our unlimited ambitions. But I think that we achieved much more than we could have appreciated or recognized at the time, and I showed you all those examples of what Shakey's influence has been in the current day, and none of that could have been remotely foreseen. So that's the story I wanted to tell you. 50 years ago, we took a big swing at a really big problem. I've done a few other things in my career that I thought were pretty cool at the time, but I have to say nothing else came close to being as important or really as much fun as making Shakey. Thanks. Do we do questions now, or can you hear the drinks melting or something, the ice melting? Yes. Not very long, and after a while the batteries leaked, and that was a problem also. The question was, how long did Shakey run on a pair of batteries? Yeah. Originally, the chief hardware designer wanted to buy these extremely expensive batteries. I don't know what the technology was 48 or so years ago, but they were going to cost over $5,000, and the multiplier is 6x for the GDP deflator. I looked that up. So $30,000 for batteries. And Charlie Rosen said, hell no, go down to Sears and get some truck batteries. That's what we did. Yes?
Actually, I'd like to pat you a little stronger on the back. You don't really know how much influence you had.
Oh, really?
In 78, 79, when some of us were playing around with semi-autonomous spacecraft,
Yeah.
we were told to go look at your operations and your ideas to see if
Where is it? Yeah. Where was this? The comment was that the Shakey stuff was used in semi-autonomous vehicle research? Spacecraft. Really? No kidding. Yeah.
What happened, we were told by our government project officers to go look at the Shakey background and experience to see whether some of our similar ideas made any sense. Now, we didn't have the practical experience of having developed it, but you guys had the practical experience of developing it. So some of your ideas were floating around in space in the early 80s. So
I think that's really interesting. I've got to tell you, though, so I'm really glad you mentioned that. Shakey project ended when we couldn't get additional funding. There was something called the Mansfield Amendment that restricted military funding for research. But I remember going around to the Navy and saying, you got to use this stuff for submersibles. And this they're not called colonels in the Navy. What are they called? Something. This is not my strong suit. Some guy with gold said, you know, the only problem we have with submersibles is the O-rings. Can you fix the O-rings? Yes. That's a really good question. How do we fit all the software in the memory? It's virtualization is what it would be today. We had these time-shared computers, and we could swap working sets in and out of this $1.5 million magnetic drum that held a whole megabyte. I know. Yes. Shakey, when did Shakey last run? No later than 1972. But there's a little backstory about that museum folks will be interested in this. Some years after Shakey was put to rest, so to speak, Nils and I tried to donate it to the Smithsonian Institution. This was long before the Computer History Museum was around. And we finally got to the right curator of things like Shakey, and this guy said, well, he said, we'll take it if you can have it come out of a closet every afternoon at 3 p.m. and run around the floor for the school children. I said, you know, it took a P10 and 10 PhDs to make the wheels turn once, you know. It's not going to happen. So the Smithsonian's loss was our gain, and I think this was another story that had a really happy ending, but it had to wait 20 years. Yes? I hate to get crass, but what did it cost? What did Shakey cost? My recollection, and there are lots of stories about this, my recollection was that the first contract was for about $500,000, which would equate to about $3 million today. Charlie was really the chief promoter of this. Charlie Rosen is a wonderful, wonderful figure who deserves to be better known. I'll tell you another story or two about him. But he had promoted this at ARPA when the office director was a guy named Ivan Sutherland, who should be familiar to many people here because he's the father of computer graphics. He went to the ARPA office there, and Ivan went so far as to write a work statement for Shakey, which would then be used to fund it. But as these things often happen, he quit before that could take place, and so we had to go back to square one and start promoting again. Let me tell you a word or two about Charlie, because he really deserves to be much better known. Charlie was the often proclaimed but almost never seen true Renaissance man. He started out life as an applied physicist, and he actually co-authored a textbook that I used as an undergraduate, the first ever textbook on solid-state circuits. But he knew a lot about what used to be called communication engineering, about, of course, solid-state physics, about manufacturing engineering, about winemaking. He was a co-founder of Ridge Vineyards. For you wine aficionados, you know about Ridge Vineyards. He was a co-founder. He had an enormous breadth and depth of knowledge and enormous creativity. So let me give you an example. There's a lot of people here I think appreciate this. Suppose I asked you, what if everybody in San Francisco screamed at the top of their lungs for exactly 1 second? If you could capture all that energy and focus it, would that be enough to boil you coffee or boil you water for a cup of tea? What do you think? Take a guess. I mean, I couldn't guess within 10 orders of magnitude. Charlie would know enough physical constants, enough biology, enough everything to give you quite a reasonable estimate off the top of his head. And he had this brilliantly associative mind that would put together ideas from totally different areas and come up with something that nobody could have thought of. And half of them were nuts. I can give you examples of those, and half of them were really, well, maybe 10% were very insightful. Charlie was a force of nature, and there's a plaque for him upstairs, but I'm making this little plug for my really most important mentor in my professional career. He's a wonderful figure. Yes?
Did you have a chance to work with the Stanford CART project at the same?
Did I have a chance to work with the Stanford CART project? No, that was a little bit late. That was Hans Moravec, who was a graduate student at the time. That was in the Stanford AI Center, was at the DC Powers building off in Arastradero Road. And every now and then, if you went in that long, windy driveway, you'd see a sign that said, "Beware robot vehicle," or something like that. And there was this thing on 4 bicycle wheels running around. But no, I think that's in the museum, isn't it, Kate? I think it's in the same, yeah. So that was a little bit later than us. But we had very close connections with all the robot groups and AI groups. And I mean, when this stuff started, there was only 4 or 5 places in the world that knew the term artificial intelligence. A few places in this country, University of Edinburgh, University of Uppsala in Sweden, that was it. So we all knew each other. It was kind of nice. The other great thing about the world back then was that nothing had been done. And so there were all these low-hanging fruits that you could pick, and we did. And not only that, you can wander from one sub-area to the other, like just using my own experience as an example. I worked a lot on computer vision. I worked on robot planning. I worked on navigation in A*STAR. I worked on all sorts of things, all in the space of a few years. Nowadays, young researchers can't do that. It takes like 2 years just to read the stuff in one micro area, and then you better start plowing, that particular vineyard, because it'll take you another 2 years to go to the next vineyard over. We could just flit around and have fun everywhere. I mean, I thought it was great. Nothing like it. Any other questions? Yes. Did I have any interaction with Doug Engelbart? Yes, personally, not professionally. Doug's Augmentation Research Center was just down the hall from my artificial intelligence, and I was the director of the Artificial Intelligence Center, and Doug was right down the hall. And we were both ARPA principal investigators, and so we go to these song and dance things you had to do twice a year. But personally, we were friends. My wife, Diane, and I used to go backpacking with Doug and his now late wife, Ballard, and I remember skinny dipping in various Yosemite lakes up there. But I mean, Doug was just a wonderful person, but it was a personal relationship and not a deep professional one. Anything else? Yes. What crazy things am I doing now? Well, Diane and I are writing the newsletter for this museum, and we go birding in various parts of the world, but I'm not doing any deep technical research these days. I consult now and then with people who actually know what's going on, but as you can see from this talk, I've adopted a personal stance or position that I'm in charge of the past, and these young guys are in charge of the future.